Whoa, I'm so listening to that music. I just forgot we were on the air. Greetings from Vermont, where, yes, it has been raining. I'm in the Northeast Kingdom. That's way far north, just south of the Canadian border. But yesterday, the heavens poured and our dirt road kind of got washed out a little bit. So there are only a couple of us on the road. I'm about a mile back in. There's one guy farther back. I had dinner at his place last night, and we got on our machines this morning and we're out there revving it up. And I can hear him from where I sit here. He's about a half mile down the road. I'll be out there soon replacing a washed out culvert. But such is the joy of rural living. And the good news is I'm not going to be in court again for 5 or 6 weeks, unless, of course, somebody calls me with a case that's just so incredibly cool. Because I'll be honest with you, I'm such a law nerd. When I packed my truck to head up here for, the next 5, 6 weeks, I did put a suit and a tie and a pair of dress shoes in there just in case duty calls. But I hope it doesn't. I need the break, and it's nice to have it. Although we're not taking a break from you all. We like the fact that you're regular listeners, and we don't want to lose you. Hey, Mike, what was up with Wimbledon this week? Big news, I hear. Generational warfare, and the 20-somethings are now on top. What happened?
Man, Wimbledon was that was amazing. So I'm not typically someone that's following tennis. I didn't play tennis growing up, but the older I get, the more I enjoy the one-on-one, that extreme scrutiny of being a one-on-one adversary. And of course, tennis is such a classy affair historically, and Wimbledon of course has its fair share of history as well. You may recall the last, decade or so has really been dominated by one or two names. And one of those names is Djokovic. And here he is on the right. And the name that is not tenured in the sport yet is the gentleman on the left, the Spaniard, the 20-year-old Carlos Alcaraz, who emerged victorious yesterday. He was the number one ranked in the world. Djokovic was number two. But this is certainly a stage that those numbers dissipate, and they are relatively meaningless in the grand scheme of things. What struck me about this is that Alcaraz actually dropped the first game 6-1. And
wow, the first set. Yeah. Wow. Yeah.
And the first game. So the first, so 6 sets to 1 in the first game. And then came back in the second game and won. And so even the score. And the third game really tells the entire tale of this entire match. And it is because when it came to, I think, the third set of that third or fourth set, I think third game, fourth set, Norm, it lasted almost a half hour, just that set between the two of these guys. It wasn't even it wasn't that point was going to give one of them the game or not. It was just one of the points within that set. And it struck me that when Alcaraz finally battled back, I think there were 13 or 14 what's known as deuces, right? So you've got this, you're at the end of the points for that given set, and you must win by 2. Right. So you get the advantage up to Djokovic, and then it gets back to even. And the advantage up to Djokovic gets back to even. Every time it goes back to even, that's a deuce. And it happened 13 or 14 times.
Wow.
Alcaraz pulled out that set, and the rest of the match, in my opinion, was written from that moment, because he battled for nearly 30 minutes to earn that. And it was the first time, I believe, that Djokovic had actually lost that sort of back and forth, that sort of volley. So I always love, bringing up the sports angle of this stuff. I think, I put here on the screen is winning the most human thing one can do. And I'm reminded of our discussion, Norm, last week when it came to AI, and we were talking about Elon Musk, and we were exploring the boundaries of St. Augustine. And I think I made the remark that very few of us will ever learn the boundaries of our natural human faculties, right? What it means to get to the end of certain elements of our being, the essence of our being, and physical attributes such as sports are one of those vessels that I look at raw human achievement. And I'm always moved by those moments, those 30-minute sets in the middle of a championship match where one is able to find really the the limits of him or herself when it matters most. So there's a strong argument, in my opinion, that winning is perhaps one of the most human things that one can do, and we should continue to strive toward that effort.
Well, I think winning, longing, desire, it's all there. I know that, I've never competed at your level, but I've done my fair share of knockaround sports, and am a Jerry athlete now. I'll get on a racquetball court or do this or that. And every now and then you just come up to somebody who's got a will to win, that is just unaccountable. Like, I play games because I enjoy them now. I like to win, but my identity isn't tied up with them. If I play with someone who's got to win, there's some part of me almost wants to just give it up just so I can relax. But it sounds like quite a match. Congratulations to the new champ. At 20 years old, I guess we've got a lot to watch from Carlos Alcaraz. I watched just one little part of a match early in the competition where Alcaraz was up 40-love. In other words, he had 3 points on the other side, and then the other guy deuced him, tied it up, and he lost his focus ever for a moment. I see that he got it back. Good. There you go.
And it was also, one element I want to bring up here as well is the humility of defeat. Djokovic he's a Hall of Famer. He is a legacy athlete in the sport. He has nothing ultimately at this point to concern himself with in terms of his reputation and legacy. But I love the post match interviews, and Djokovic was as classy as it gets. This match for him was grueling because he was disappointing himself. You could see that throughout the entire match. Shots that he's used to just flicking the wrist and being able to make were hitting the net and not making it over. He was having back and forth with the judge. I think at one point the judge even called a delay of match on him, which is just, from a practitioner's perspective, you can understand when you don't expect a judge to start harping on a really nuanced point of procedure. And especially if it's a high stakes environment, that can be really distracting. I ultimately think that that there was an accumulation of events that really just credit Carlos for being able to supply that consistent pressure as a 20-year-old to let Djokovic continue making those mistakes and accumulate a weight sufficient that he could not overcome. So, yeah, match.
Great match. Lots. And speaking of competitive sports, the presidential candidates were on display a lot in the last week or so. Tucker's come out of I don't know, hiding, retirement, whatever he is, banishment, and has interviewed a lot of them. And some people are saying, hey, Tucker's the only one who shows the ability to actually lead. Maybe he should run. I don't think he is, but Vivek Ramaswamy managed to wow some crowds this weekend. What happened with Vivek?
Vivek was at the Family Leadership Summit, I think, put on by the Blaze over the weekend, and I'll throw up just a still.
I hope not.
I'll throw up a still here of the interview that he had with Tucker Carlson. But I continue to be preoccupied, and I think I sent you a text, Norm, saying that I want us to continue claiming the mantle of Vivek, and not that we can claim credit for anything that he's done, but certainly you and I have discussed in good faith the merits of what he is saying, and we've continued to elevate the message and at least honor what he's doing as a political outsider. He is not a pedigreed politician. He doesn't come from a family that has a legacy in politics or otherwise. I think his pursuits in the private sector are more than enough for someone in his position to typically opt out of anything that would subject them to scrutiny and the toils of a life in politics. So I think that as he is I have here on the screen the first millennial, and he says this in the beginning of his back and forth with Tucker at this summit, that he's the first millennial to run for president as a Republican, which is fascinating because from where I'm sitting, most millennials are Democrats at this point.
You sent me an interesting interview you did with the guy who does breakfast champs or whatever that is.
Oh yeah. I'll think of it in just a second. Keep going.
And he's a young African American guy, and Vivek was talking about the dream that is America, and the host was saying, well, that's not a dream that included my people, and yada yada yada, and Vivek sort of took a deep breath and looked him in the eye and said, well, wait a minute, we may not have lived up to our ideals as a people, but we are a people with ideals. And you can call us hypocrites in ways that you don't call the Chinese hypocrites or, the modern India hypocrites, because we failed to live up to high ideals that identify us. And rather than looking at the failures, why not celebrate the ideals and see what steps we can take next to fulfill them? And I thought it was a courageous moment for Vivek, playing to the identity card. And he was in a forum where basically his ideals were going to be, if not mocked, at least tweaked.
Yeah, it was with Charlemagne the God, who's a name that you and I have discussed on this podcast.
We have.
Before, especially with respect to one Ye, formerly known as Kanye West. Charlemagne the God is not necessarily he's a known quantity in that world, and in the context of the conversation that we're referencing now was where Charlemagne the God premised, I think his question, or really his statement to Vivek, saying that he could blame a lot of today's societal ills on white supremacy, and that America was a failed experiment, et cetera, to which Vivek responded beautifully. And I think that moment, Norm, may have turned a lot of heads for those that would not have otherwise encountered Vivek, by saying that we are a nation of men, meaning that we are a nation of not gods. Right. And that
and a nation of men with failings, with limited government and high ideals.
Founded on ideals. Right. And that as long as we are in search of these ideals, it means that we did have these aspirations, that there's something there for us to aspire to. And that's better than we can say for the balance of the world when it comes to China and otherwise.
Whatever our failings, I don't see mass migration to any other country on earth. And so while we're busy hating ourselves, the rest of the world seems interested in banging a door down here to get a seat at the table before the scraps disappear. And so, Vivek is calling out people for their own hypocrisy. I want to pivot a little bit. I see you've got something on the screen there.
I just want to say this because, I'm bringing this up very purposefully. These have become the 10 items that Vivek is saying over and over and over. And I'll move this up so we can see all 10 of them. But God is real. There are two genders. Human flourishing requires fossil fuels. Reverse racism is racism. An open border is no border. Parents determine the education of their children. The nuclear family is the greatest form of governance known to mankind. Capitalism lifts people up from poverty. There are 3 branches of the U.S. government, not 4. The U.S. Constitution is the strongest guarantor of freedoms in history. And he is campaigning on this as aggressively and as resolutely as one can imagine. I'm constantly in awe of his energy. I'm constantly in awe of how busy he is. I think that perhaps he would give you a run for your money in terms of how prolific he is, but he's out there. I would love for us to have an opportunity to speak with him. He actually did have a tweet very recently about the nature of being an illegal immigrant to the United States. And being able to take advantage of birthright citizenship, which is contradicted by much of the Democrat platform, but not by his presence in U.S. politics. He was born to parents in the United States who were legally in the country. His birthright citizenship is claimed on top of that. So interesting that he's addressing that on his Twitter now. I do think that that'll be something for us to monitor going forward.
Well, I'm sorry you used the term birthright citizenship, because as you know, we've got one dedicated listener who probably tweets 10 times a week. When are you guys going to talk about birthright citizenship? When are you going to talk about the fact that Kamala Harris isn't qualified to be president of the United States? And it's just not an issue that I have been able to warm to. I recall reading Jerome Corsi's book about Obama's citizenship way back when. I don't even recall how many years it was. And then next thing you know, I was invited to debate Corsi on a Florida radio show. Of course, I didn't travel to Florida. I did the debate. And I thought Corsi was an out and out nutcase. And I thought a lot of the argument about birthright citizenship was a semaphore, a code for some sort of racism. I'm not sure what I think about it now, but I think that the Constitution seems clear enough to me that if you're born here, according to the 14th Amendment, you have birthright citizenship. If you're born on American soil, you have American citizenship, notwithstanding the fact that your parents may be illegal immigrants. And I suppose that's good, since my father snuck into the country from Crete, when he was a young man. But I was born, at least my birth certificate says I was born in Detroit, and that makes me a citizen, although I won't be running for anything anytime soon, except maybe to the coffee machine this morning for another cup. Hey, so I want to pivot to our law student project. We put out a call last week, and we'll repeat it frequently. We want to get to know incoming law students. We want to get to know students who are currently in the middle of their legal studies, and we put a call out for you to send us your curricula, or your syllabi rather, from your various courses, because I want to see what you're reading. I want to see what's being assigned, and the reason for that is I have a fear that legal education has turned away from something and from things fundamental. And the result of that could be a generation of lawyers coming up that don't have an anchor in really what makes this country great. And so I've recommended that rising L's, that is, people who are on their way into law school in the fall, take some time this summer to read Locke's second treatise on government. Written in the 17th century. It is a classic on the nature of government. And so, because I don't want to be a hypocrite myself, although I often am, I'm rereading it now myself, and I'm about done with this reading. And I'm reminded of the simple pleasures of political philosophy. That is the encounter with this mystery of governance, this fact that we live together seemingly in harmony, and how do we give an account of it? In the second treatise of government, Locke does sort of what Vivek does, or I should say Vivek is doing sort of like what Locke did, and that is trying to break the world down in fundamental terms. And so Locke was writing in 17th century England after a very tumultuous century, a century that really looks a little bit like ours is. There were culture wars there. And on the one side were the royalists and those who had an affinity for the high Anglican Church and Roman Catholicism. And on the other side were the dissenters, the Calvinists, the Presbyterians, Protestants, ultimately the Puritans and the Levelers, who had a different view of things as fundamental as how you take communion in a church service, how the altar should be placed in a church, whether stained glass windows were sacrilegious or not. And these culture wars led to violence. They led to people being imprisoned and tried by the Star Chambers. They led to people being held at public pillories, their ears clipped and in some cases cut off. They led from time to time to executions, violent executions. And ultimately, these culture wars led to civil war. And the 17th century in England was a time of tremendous violence and social uncertainty. Charles I was beheaded by Parliament. Oliver Cromwell formed a protectorate that is a sort of interim government, an experiment with the Commonwealth. There was a restoration of the monarchy with Charles II, and then those who had executed Charles I were hunted down, several of them taking flight and hiding in the New Haven area, Captains Whaley, Gough, and Dixwell, and hence the fact that in New Haven, 3 of the principal streets in town are named Whaley, Gough, and Dixwell. And these men were hunted down and brought, when they could be, they were executed. Then there was a restoration of the monarchy with James II, and a Bill of Rights was enacted in England that settled, I guess, once and for all in their constitutional systems, in their minds, the limits of the royal power and guaranteed to individuals certain rights. This all before the United States was founded, and during a period where England was shedding many of its members of its society that couldn't find a place in English society to North America. And Locke wrote about what made for a stable society in the wake of this instability. And the key insight from the second treatise of government for Locke is that consent is the foundation of good government. And so he created an elaborate philosophical anthropology that the scholars debate, did he really mean to think this actually happened? Was there ever such a place? But he said that initially individuals lived independently of one another, that they lived in the state of nature. And in the state of nature, each of us had a right to do a God-given right. Locke believed in natural law, that there was the law of reason, of right reason, and this is reflected in revelation, that is scriptural truths, and that according to natural law, we each had a right to self-preservation. And we were in a state of potential and perpetual war with one another, because that right of self-preservation could lead to violence if you tried to overstep your bounds and take something that belonged to me. That the function of natural, that the world was given to us in common, but that each of us could acquire through our own labor rights to certain limited portions of it, portions necessary and sufficient to sustain ourselves, but no more than that. And so in order to enjoy the security of our possessions and of our persons, we left the state of nature by unanimous agreement. And this is where it gets a little tricky in Locke, to form civil societies. And in those civil societies, we then agreed that we would be governed, and that we would be governed by majority rule. And so what makes government legitimate is the consent of the governed. And this is a very, very powerful idea in the West. We've talked before on this show about the concept of legitimacy. And you see in Locke echoes of what Max Weber wrote about centuries later in his classic essay, Politics as a Vocation. He says, a political society is one where individuals have yielded their right to use force in defense of themselves to the state. And the state acquires the ability basically to judge over others and to impose penalties for breaches of the law. And we become more secure in our persons and in our estate and in our property by yielding that power. And so when we yield our natural liberty in the state of nature, we acquire a sense of security in our persons and in our properties and our being. And that sense of security comes of our willingness to consent to be governed. What happens, Locke asks, when that government fails to meet its basic obligations to provide us with security? What happens, he argues, when somebody makes a claim to absolute monarchy? Now, recall, Locke was writing at the end of the 17th century after a very tumultuous century in England, having to do with the proper scope and power of kings. And James I and then Charles I had asserted broad royal prerogatives, broad royal powers, typically over the generation of revenue necessary to fight certain wars England was involved with on the continent, incident to the wars of religion, the 30 Years' Wars, and so forth. Locke says that an absolute monarch is a return to the state of nature, because in that instance, you've got a monarch against whom there is no appeal. You can only appeal to heaven, as it were. You can only defend yourself with force, which is your right in the state of nature. The only government that provides security for all is a government according to law. And so, these ideas, we acquire them with the ABCs that we learn in elementary school, and we don't much think about their sources and their foundations and their practical efficacy. And when we don't often apply them concretely to analysis of issues that affect us in our daily lives, except perhaps now in the United States, and I would suggest except perhaps now in the training of the next generation of lawyers. What is the foundation of good governance? Is it consent of the governed? And are there instances when government can get out over its skis, where it can depart from its service of the common good in such a way that it justifies the people in revolting, in overturning the government? And, for Locke, the answer is yes. Because government is founded in our consent, or on our consent, and because it's created for the purpose of accomplishing what we cannot accomplish on our own in the state of nature, when political society fails and life becomes difficult in ways that government, because government fails to meet its basic obligations, we have the right to take it back, as it were. And so, it seems to me that you can read Locke with profit, these days and look at our society and look at claims among the populists, for example, who seem to believe that we need to take government back, or claims about the deep state, having forgotten its origins and having acquired a sort of sense of absolute prerogative, or AI.
Right, permanent managerial state, as one Vivek would refer to, I think, as cogently as possible to appeal to the widest audience, because I think Locke's thoughts here, like you said, you can read it with profit. The express versus implied consent analysis is really interesting, as is the limitations on that consent, which we're talking about the limitations on the consent of the governed, right?
Yeah, well, here's the reason. This is my prism as I read Locke now through, and I'll finish my reading of it again today, so maybe we can return to it later in the week. Locke doesn't fully address the situation that I think obtains in the world today, and that is that none of us left the state of nature by consent to agree to go into a civil society where we created a government that governs on the basis of majority rule. At best, most of us acquiesce to the surroundings, to our surroundings. We recognize the world as having a structure, and we know that to get along, we have to go along. And so I didn't consent in any meaningful way to the level of taxation that I endure, but I pay the taxes because to not do so would be to invite legal scrutiny, controversy, and possibly incarceration. And I make a sort of utilitarian judgment. That is that compliance, I get more from compliance than I do from not. And so for me, the notion that somehow we have consented to be governed as we are is a legal fiction that I think we're straining to the breaking point. And paradoxically, the only people who really do consent to be governed as we are naturalized citizens. And so arguably, and this is for you, Thomas Barrett, the naturalized citizens almost strike me as superior citizens to those who are birthright citizens, because naturalized citizens have to go through a process of education. They have to swear an oath. They have to understand our institutions, our origins, and our foundations. And they have to forswear their loyalty to another regime to become subjects, to become citizens here. We don't put kids through civic education classes any longer, civics. We have a stunning a degree of civic illiteracy in the United States. And the result is, I don't think we really have a fully formed citizenry.
Well, and I agree. One thing I've been thinking about lately, Norm, on this topic is that I think that ignorance of basic civics is what actually forwards what we're talking about when we say the fourth branch of government, or that administrative state. That administrative state is populated largely by individuals that lack the self-awareness of basic fundamental civics. And I mean at a very certain level. I'm not talking about those that are above. I'm talking about the managerial class, those that are simply there getting a salary and benefits and a pension, doing things in a role that is purely administrative in nature, delegated by Congress, and they have no desire to evolve the law or to do right by those to which it applies.
That's true. And, it is a constitutional conundrum, because there is, as Vivek points out, only 3 branches of government, not 4. But yet what we've now come to ask government to do is so complicated, it almost requires a professional bureaucracy with expertise to manage what we've asked it to do. And so are we at a time of constitutional crisis in the United States, where we'll have a third founding? And what am I talking about? Obviously, the first founding was incident to the revolution and the formation of the Republic and the adoption of the United States Constitution in 1789. Scholars refer to the second founding as taking place after the Civil War and the adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Eric Foner has a wonderful book called The Second Founding, which I encourage everyone to read. At both the initial founding and at the second founding, we needed to come together to have a new core understanding of the nature, structure, and function of government and government's role in our lives. I would suggest that in our time right now, and I think this is what, the Trumpism, the MAGA movement, the great divide between left and right. I think we're at a turning point in the country now where what's at stake is our vision of ourselves, our destiny, what ideals will hold us together. Vivek appeals to me because he appeals to an old tradition in American thought, classical liberalism, a commitment to the Constitution, a theocratic a philosophic commitment to being open to the role of the divine in normal life. And these are ideas that used to be comfortable in the West. They're under challenge now. So the reason I want you new law students to go out and read Locke's second treatise is I want you to be radicalized by the concept that you're governed by consent. I want you to be radicalized by the notion that legitimacy means people recognize that government is right because they've created to accomplish ends that they have a right to demand that government fulfill. I want you to read it because I want you to challenge the orthodoxy. I want you to challenge the notion that government is just there and that we have to accommodate ourselves to what government requires of us. That has never been the American way. And so Locke's second treatise on government, to my mind, is the classic treatise on limited government. And the key to the American experiment is that government has always been limited. And so much of the globalist rhetoric, so much of the rhetoric of creating a world government and so forth would seek to deprive we, the people on this continent, of our ability to consent to be governed as we choose to be governed. And I think you lose sight of that at the cost of something fundamental in the American experiment.
And this feels like a lot is coming back to center again, just to remind us of our discussion last week about the underbelly of an artificial intelligence emerging, right? And what about our individual sovereignty that we forego in, for the, I guess, some sort of convenience of technology, et cetera. How much of our consent is being given away by.
Well, I don't know that you see, that's the interesting thing. You never give your consent away. It can be taken from you, but it's a it is a radicalizing thing to say, I have certain rights that are inalienable, that cannot be taken from me. I can pretend to give them away, but as Locke argues in the second treatise, you don't have a right to commit suicide, whether in fact or spiritually, because we are created, not made, and we have an obligation to our Creator to flourish and to seek conditions of human flourishing. Now, you may say, oh, how quaint to talk about a creator. We've evolved from nothing and we will dissolve to nothing, ashes to ashes, and dust to dust. We're just data points in infinity. That's a view of the universe you can choose, but the logical conclusion of that is a sense of spiritual empowerment and certitude that no person who seeks dignity and significance in their own skin really, really believes. And so we've talked about, Pascal's wager way back. Pascal, the brilliant French mathematician in the 17th century, was struggling with theological questions, and he didn't know if God existed or not. But his view was, I'm going to gamble. I'm going to take a wager. I'm going to assume he does, and I'm going to try to live a godly life because if I'm wrong, the benefit is I behaved morally. If I die, I burn eternally. I'd say it's time for a new wager. We'll call it Pattis's wager. And that is gamble on the divine for a sense of enrichment. If you choose to believe that you are just random data points stumbling through infinite space and time, then don't complain if big data runs over you. But if some part of you says, I object, I want to have destiny, agency in my own life, then consider the possibility that there's a theology that supports that notion, and that being made in the image of God means that you have the ability to create significance from nothing as God created life from nothing, as God created the universe ex nihilo. It's a simple theological commitment with profound consequences, and it's a commitment that informs Locke's second treatise, because the weakness of the book from a modernist perspective is Locke talks about right reason, Locke talks about natural law, Locke talks about the significance, the eternal significance of some of these ideas. And these are not ideas that are accepted in the academy any longer. And when you go into law school as a rising 0L, as a rising 1L, you're going to be steeped in a culture that regards us as nothing more than data points in space and time. And the goal of so much of modernity is to find the right equation to get all of those data points to hum in harmony. And that's the promise of AI. that we can harness enough big data to distribute resources such that we are all the same in some insignificant way, that will yield the thoughtful among you to pull your hair out and scream and say, no, not I. I do not choose to go along. And I want to exercise my right to resist, perhaps even my right to revolt.
Photography asks a quick question. Photography says, I love how Norm is pointing out the link from God to man and the essential connection, and then also follows it up by saying, isn't the entire legal system predicated on free will?
I think it is, because, we punish people. You'll be taught in law school, those of you who are on your way, that the criminal sanction has a number of functions. General deterrence, that is to deter others from doing what the accused has done. Specific deterrence, that is to punish that person, to make sure he doesn't do it again. Rehabilitation, and then safety of society. None of that makes any sense if we're just machines tumbling in space who did what our prior variables told us we ought to do. The moral impulse is built on a notion that we have a sense of freedom, that we have the choice, that we could have done otherwise. Thus, at the outer limits of the criminal law, we say that a person can't be punished if they're incompetent. They can't even go to trial unless they understand the nature of the proceedings and can assist in their own defense. Why is that? Because we value human agency. Look at the Bill of Rights, and I'll just go through them in a hurry. The First Amendment, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech. That's because we have value in ourselves. What we say, how we express ourselves is significant. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. That's the right to protect oneself from others. Third Amendment, avoiding quartering soldiers in your own home. That's because your home, as the Fourth Amendment teaches us, is your castle. And thus we value individual agency and autonomy, and we place limits on what the state can do and say that the Fourth Amendment limits the state. The Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. We don't want to force people to testify against themselves because that's demeaning. Sixth Amendment rights to fair criminal trials. Similarly, Seventh Amendment rights to civil trials. We'll talk about that another day. That's a whole different topic. Eighth Amendment rights against cruel and unusual punishment. There you go again. We're not going to treat people as ends to our purposes, or as means to our purposes. All people are ends in themselves. And in the Ninth and 10th Amendment, we reserve powers to the people in the states that aren't explicitly recognized. It's all steeped in limited government. It's all steeped in the notion of consent of the governed. It's all steeped in the notion that we as individuals have significance independent of government and can place fundamental limits on government. When you go to law school these days, you're going to be taught that history is that history governs, that we are the bearers of signs and signals and stigmata from our past, and that the goal of the law is to somehow provide a sense of equality, to right the wrongs of history. But that begs the larger question. If we're just history, then why doesn't history continue to unfold? And why doesn't yesterday's oppressor become tomorrow's and remain tomorrow's oppressor? And that's because we say it's wrong. So we pay lip service to agency while denying agency, and the result is a law that stumbles into incoherence and becomes merely a power grab between warring identities, which feeds the sense of social instability that makes our time so wrought. And hence, you need to get back into the classics. Forget reading the New York Times 1619 Project. Pick up Thomas Hobbes, pick up John Locke, read the classics of Anglo-American political philosophy and have them inform your legal studies, because at the outer limit of every legal argument is fundamentally a philosophic question about which plenty has been written. Your ability to thrive as a lawyer and to help your clients advance your interests is a direct function of your ability to master those discussions at the margin.
I'll end here by just reading quickly about government or trust in government from Locke. Quote, whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any farther obedience, and are left to the common refuge, which God hath provided for all men against force and violence. By this breach of trust, they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberty, and by the establishment of a new legislative, such as they shall think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society.
Yeah, you kind of wish Locke could have said the same thing in about half as many words. And one of the other reasons to read 16th, 17th century English classics is you get to appreciation for the fact that we now have uniform spelling, that we have rules of punctuation, and that we write with brevity. But I mean, it's easy to ridicule Locke. I mean, he was present at the foundation of a glorious tradition. He was reacting against the divine right of kings. And, you know, we've talked before whether the notion of individualism has outlived its usefulness. Because the second treatise in the social contract theory was a reaction against the divine right of kings. And so now, have we come to the end of individualism? And if so, what philosophical commitment will arise that will challenge it in the same way that the social contracts challenge the divine right of kings? Don't know the answer here today. We might discover it later in the week, and you'll have to listen in.
Well, we didn't really get to the RFK Jr. Discussion.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's one we should reserve for later this week, probably tomorrow. I know that there'll be more discussion out in the ether today, and I've asked the penultimate question here: is establishment media using its most powerful spell on RFK Jr.? So we'll talk about that and what the spell is, perhaps. And I think, Norm, you would have been cold to that question prior to actually viewing the video. So homework for everyone is to actually go and view the video that has been circulating and causing a stir, which has caused the New York Times, for example, to say that Robert F. Kennedy airs bigoted new COVID conspiracy theory about Jews and Chinese, and then has caused the New York Post to say RFK Jr. says COVID may have been ethnically targeted to spare Jews. These are headlines from across the political spectrum. They all are angling toward the same thing, and Norm and I are going to ask what that means.
In the context of Kennedy's book on Fauci, which I've begun to listen to, here's a pro tip to Kennedy if you're listening. Drop the adjectives, stick to the nouns, tell your story. All that chest thumping isn't making the narrative advance any better, but the narrative he's advancing is a compelling one. And that is, early in COVID, we may have the means, may have had the means to provide effective therapeutic care to people before they were hospitalized, before they became critically ill. But there was one force in the world that didn't want that to happen. And that force had enough control to stop it. It was Big Pharma, the same people who brought oxycodone and sought to be unaccountable for that. What did the Sacklers and Pfizer have in common? Let's talk about that later in the week.
Absolutely. Norm, thank you as always for getting the week started off strong. You go and get your culvert started. I know you're looking forward to putting your hands on something physical rather than toiling in the trenches of the mental this week. And I can certainly appreciate that. You can find us here on Rumble Video, YouTube Live, and Twitter Live / Periscope every morning at 8 a.m. You can also find us shortly after these streams air on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, Audible, etc., wherever you find podcasts. All that we ask is that you give us a 5-star rating on any of those platforms where you're listening to a podcast. And if you're catching us live, be sure that you're subscribed. Be sure you like these videos. And most importantly, please share these. And if you haven't listened to Friday's stream with one Jimmy Valley of Val Hill Capital regarding the SEC v. Ripple Labs, Inc., judgment or order that came down late last week, do yourself the favor and go to an interesting discussion on blockchain, and then also the origins of our current federal securities laws, namely the Howey test, and how an investment contract is viewed within the context of an emerging economy of cryptocurrency and blockchain networks. So Norm, I'll let you get back to being out there in the real world, touching grass, as the kids say. I'm going to get to work here in Greensboro and see if we can't do some good things for clients this week.
Talk to you all tomorrow. Be well, everybody. Remember, our goal is to make America think again, and it starts with you. Ask the tough questions, demand the answers. Your interlocutor may not have them, but the important thing is asking.
Absolutely. All right, Norm. See you later.
Ciao.
Thank you, everyone.